Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Have you listening into another episode here today. As always, if you like what you hear, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Nick, how's it going this week?
It's been a busy week. We were talking about that earlier, and just kind of like even the way we're having to record this week. But it's been good, and it's always good. It's always a good week to be able to do the things that we're able to do. But I think especially it's good to be able to sit down and just chat in Hebrews with you for a little bit. How's your week been?
It's good. It's snowed today. I'm kind of looking out the window. Can't tell if it's still snowing because it's like that little snow where you can't really tell is this real or not. But it was definitely real when I was walking in it earlier. So that just shows change of season, which it's a good thing. That means woke up, got to see another day, got to see another season and whatnot. And so life is good. But we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 12 today. And Nick, it is your turn to read. So why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, snow sounds good. I kind of miss the snow out here. We don't see that out here too much. All right. So we're in Hebrews chapter 12. Let's start reading in verse 1. I'm reading from the New American Standard translation. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we had respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, so that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight the paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root or bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them. For they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the myriads of angels, the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if those did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape who turn away from him who warns from heaven. And his voice shook the earth then, but now has promised, saying, Yet once more, and I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. This expression yet once more denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken as of created things, so that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So we're looking kind of at the culmination of the Hebrew writer's letter here. We got to turn to Jesus. We need to listen to him and hear what he has to say. So as we're kind of like working through chapter 12, Cody, how do you see all this fitting together for us?
Yeah, I think 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2 are a wrap up of the section that started back in chapter 11. Hopefully everybody remembers last week we were in that Hall of Fame of faith, by faith, Abel, etc., Abraham, etc., where he went through, really, he was showing what endurance and faith looked like, which was kind of his hook at the end of chapter 10. Like, hey, you guys need to endure. You guys need to have faith. Okay, here are some other people who have had faith. Well, verses 1 and 2 of this chapter really turns the attention to Christ, because Christ is the ultimate example of endurance and of faith. And that's why he is the source, the perfecter, or the finisher of our faith, because everything that we're trying to do, he's done. And he's the pioneer, I think, is another way that this term can be used. He did it first. And so if we want to know how to endure and how to have faith, well, we can look at Jesus. You think about him dying on the cross and all of the suffering that was involved with that, the ridicule from the people, like he did all that. And so Jesus went through that process of, he was given the instructions, like, this is what you need to do. He had the faith to say, yes, Lord, I will do that. He endured a lot of, bad and wicked and evil things. But then at the end of it, well, guess what? He was delivered, because now he sits on the right hand of God. And so we now have the opportunity to kind of go through that same process. And maybe more specifically, those first readers, they are now in that position where they can go through that process. So that's verses 1 and 2. And then after that, I would say the chapter is broken up into 2 big parts that have 2 smaller sections. So you got verses 3 through 17 that talks about discipline from the Lord. So 3 through 11, it's a section about how this discipline is coming from the Lord. And it's there to help the listeners kind of transform the way that they're thinking, I would say, about the bad things that are happening to them, right? So they're living for Christ, and or even not living for Christ, and bad things are going on around them. Well, how should they perceive that? Maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's a godly reason why these things are happening. And then 12 to 17 is a more practical section about, okay, once you've changed your mind, once you're viewing this the right way, what are some steps that you need to take in order to get the most out of what it is that's going on here, both individually and collectively as the group, the church there. Then the rest of the chapter, 18 through the end, it serves as a conclusion to the 2 major arguments that he's been making all throughout the letter. Number 1, life in Christ is better than going back to Judaism. And I would say 18 to 24 gives a wrap up to that argument. And then this is all part of God's plan. God has always planned for the old to go away. And so there's another piece of evidence that's given for that towards the end. And so super excited about this chapter as always. So why don't you kick us off with the discipline section, and then we'll just go back and forth from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love this in the way that it melds really well with really the context, like you said, from all the way back in chapter 10. Like he's trying to give them an encouragement to endure. And this picture of why we need to endure is what's under discussion, right? So you've not resisted to the point of shedding blood, after he just talked about Jesus's faith going to the cross. And so this discipline here, it's not punishment. And I don't think the Hebrew writer is wanting his original audience nor us to think of any challenging thing that we endure because of our faith as God punishing us. But rather, he's wanting us to understand that every person of faith has to endure challenging things because of their faith. And that's a training ground. It's to understand and to be trained to trust God more. And so discipline here is really about training and instruction. That Greek word, it's quite literally the idea of being instructed. And so when you understand what God is saying, There are different ways that we need to learn things. And as we grow and mature, that type of discipline transforms as our faith grows. We're going to have to step into that faith, which is going to create challenges. For the Hebrew Christians that the Hebrew writer is talking to, this discipline is they're training themselves to work away from Judaism and to lean fully into Christ. And in that way, there's a really practical application for us, is that like our discipline in this life is the faith that it takes to step away from living for ourselves, living the way that we used to live without Jesus, and step into living fully and listening fully to Jesus. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. As a matter of fact, the connotation here of discipline means that it's actually going to be really challenging and difficult. And he even makes that point in the way that he talks about it. He uses the analogy of earthly fathers disciplining their children. And they did it for a short time as it seemed best to them, because this is the time that they had. When we're, as parents, we only have our kids for a short amount of time. That training has to happen early, often, and for that short period of time so that they're ready to be adults, right? And we understand that concept. But God disciplines us for our good so that we can share in his holiness. It's not a short time thing. It's an ongoing training ground. For as long as we live, we're being trained. So then he comes into this section, and I'm kind of jumping into the next section a little bit, but he's all the discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful. Right? It's not going to be easy. It's actually really hard. And so then we have to help each other out. We got to strengthen each other. And just kind of, Cody and I were talking about this analogy, and I mentioned something from back when I used to play sports, and Cody's like, you mentioned like, I need to bring that up. And so I'm going to here, because I think it kind of fits in with this picture of discipline, is like when we are building each other up, that's how we're going to endure better. But it's all going to be hard. We used to have to run laps. I'll use the term laps. I don't know if everybody knows the term that we called them. It was like run across the football field and back 4 times. And we had to do it in a timed way. And some of us can make that time a little bit easier than others. Some of our teammates were never going to make that time unless we jumped in and we ran alongside them, or we literally carried them the last few steps of the way. But if they didn't make the time, we all had to run again. So we were motivated. We were looking into that. That was hard. It was challenging for all of us, but it was worth the challenge to meet the reward that the whole team accomplished this goal. And I think that's where, even as we kind of dive into this chapter more, there are individual implications, but certainly when we get to verse 12, it branches beyond ourselves, like this endurance. It's not just so that I obtain holiness. It's so that we obtain the goal of the presence of the Lord, the holiness of the Lord. Like there's something greater that we're working towards as a unit. And so I think that what he's doing is just adding value to the discipline here. But Cody, what do you see? Kind of like moving on and kind of looking at this section of discipline here. What do you see?
Yeah, I see the same perspective shift that you just illustrated at the end, that like at some point it moves just from, how do I do right to how do I help others do right too? And so like there is that change that needs to happen. I think there's a perspective change that needs to happen when it comes to just thinking about, or how we think about discipline in general, because like discipline's not a bad thing. In fact, the way the Hebrews writer says it, like if you aren't being disciplined, that's the problem, because that makes you an illegitimate child. And it's a little bit of a callback to Hebrews 5:8, a verse that I don't know we spent a ton of time talking about, but it's where, Christ learned obedience through the sufferings. And that verse just feels weird. Like, what do you mean Christ learned obedience? It's like, well, it means he was trained through the sufferings, right? Like the sufferings helped him accomplish God's will more and more. So these Jewish Christians who are suffering, they're going to have to change their perspective to see this as like, okay, we're being like Christ. Like God is treating us the same way that he treated Christ, because we're sons, just like Christ is his son too. And so there is that perspective shift that has to happen. But like you said, even once you do understand discipline, it's still hard, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And so that's where in verse 12, the strength in the hands that are weak, like you said, we got to look out for others who are afflicted. But even the rest of that section, 13 starts out with that pursue peace with everyone. And I love he adds in pursue peace and holiness. with everyone, because it's like we don't pursue peace, to the exclusion of, the plan, the path, us being set apart for the Lord. But if we can find a way to merge those things to where we have both, well, that's really the goal. Like, we want to be set apart with the Lord, with the others that are set apart as well. But we need each other to get through these trials. That's why peace is so important, because Nick, I can better assist you when you and I are on good terms. If you and I have beef and I see something going on with you, we're like, now I don't even have the foundation to even approach you to have that conversation, because as soon as I start walking up, you're going to be thinking about whatever issue it is that we have with one another. Thankfully, Nick and I wouldn't have an issue, but you guys know what I'm getting at. We need each other. And I think this is another nice little callback to Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 about, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together. It's like the reason we need the assembly, it's not so that we just have another box to check. It's not so that we just have another thing to hold over other people's heads of like, oh, I was at church and you weren't. It's like, no, we need the assembly because we need each other, and we need time together to grow together, to strengthen our bonds and strengthen those relationships. But once those relationships are secured, the next thing he says is, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. Specifically, make sure nobody is carrying around that root of bitterness towards God for the discipline. And you can kind of imagine how if you understand that, hey, the Lord is disciplining me through these challenges, there could be some resentment towards him. Like, well, why did you have to do it this way? Why did you have to do this at all? Well, in order to help root that out, like, we got to be holding ourselves accountable. We got to be looking towards one another to make sure everybody has the right type of mindset. He brings up Esau here. Esau was a man who traded long-term benefit for short-term relief. He traded his blessing. So you have that pot of stew. And he ends up being very upset about that choice. And a lot of real bad stuff ends up happening to him because he's that type of guy. Well, the Hebrews writer is saying, hey, look, like, there are brethren among you that may be in danger of making the same mistake. There are brethren among you who may say, you know what, I'll give up the long-term goals of being with God, of heaven, however it is you want to think about that. I'll give that up so that I can get a little temporary relief from the suffering. And he's like, no, you got to be there to say, no, we're aiming for something more, something greater than this. We're still vulnerable to the same type of spirit of trading in the long term for the short term. So we've got to be careful, and I think we've got to help other people out of that mentality too, especially when we individually or even collectively are in these seasons of discipline. Nick, do you see anything else in this discipline section, or do you want to move to the next section?
Well, I just think it transitions really well into like the purpose of our discipline, right? And even like the analogy with Esau here is, you have like this person who, when you look back at that story that's being referenced, he had the promises of God. They were his. He was the firstborn son, and he traded all of that away for a bowl of soup, a bowl of beans, because he was hungry. The moment meant more than the promise. And that can cause us to shrink back in our faith, which like broadens us out to this like greater picture. And now like Esau is an example for us as we look at that story, and we're like, why would you do that? Except how often in our day-to-day routine are we tempted to shrink back in our faith and our trust in God and in his promises and in the ultimate goal for something in that moment. And so Esau now becomes an example, because it's too late for Esau to make any changes, right? Like, you have this picture of Esau in verse 17, that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, right? Like, here's how this played out. Like, he didn't really want to lose that blessing, but in that moment, it didn't matter to him, because we're coming to be with God. So every promise of God has to be holy to us. And we have to be holy because God is holy. And all of that stuff matters. So that leads us, I think, right into verse 18 in this next section. He says, because we haven't come to Mount Sinai, right? That's the reference there. We haven't come to this mountain that's a physical mountain that can be touched, to a blazing fire, the burning bush that Moses came to. And God said, take the sandals off your feet because you're standing on holy ground. If they needed to prepare themselves for 3 days for God to speak to them, and they needed to be like this picture of cleaned up and holy and ready for God to speak to them, and they still weren't ready. Like, how much more do we need to be disciplined in our faith and trained every single day so that we are ready to be in the presence of God? And that's the picture. The contrast here is these two mountains, right? It's like the physical representation of God's presence in the Old Testament was Mount Sinai. That's where the law came from. But it transitions even into the prophets. And now he says, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God. Here, we are not coming to a physical mountain. We are coming to God's dwelling place to be in his presence. So we're not shrinking back. We're becoming more holy. We're encouraging each other. And I'm glad that you pointed that out in verse 14. We're pursuing peace and holiness. And because we want to see the Lord. It's like, here's the thing, without sanctification, no one will see the Lord, right? Without holiness and being cleaned up for those 3 days, they weren't going to be ready to be in the presence of the Lord in the Mount Sinai story in Exodus 19. And so you have all this. And so, but it goes from fear, and even Moses's fear. It speaks to that. In Deuteronomy, Moses references back to the fear that he had that God was going to destroy the people out of their disobedience and out of their unholiness. He said, no, we have come to Mount Zion. And this is a callback again to chapter 10, right? This picture of because of Jesus' sacrifice, because he stands ministering daily, he stands ministering his blood for our sins, we can confidently come before the throne. So we have come to Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, the myriad of angels, the assembly of the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. We have come to the blessings and the fulfillment and the goodness of all of this. That's amplifying not our fear, but our hope, which is going to also help us to endure the discipline. So I think it all like flows really well. Like, what is our motivation? What are we trying to do? We're trying to go to heaven. Like, that's how we talk about it, right? We're trying to go to heaven. We're trying to be in the presence of God. We are his people. And so every training and discipline and instruction is making us more and more ready to be with him, which is the point. Because God is always trying to speak to us so that we will hear him, whether it's at Mount Sinai, whether it's through the prophets who spoke in many different ways, whether it's through the miracles that were performed to try to confirm that these things were true and from God. But Jesus is the only one who speaks the new covenant of forgiveness. He says at the end of this kind of like transition section, here is Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. And we have come to his blood. And it's better than the blood of Abel, because the blood of Abel cried out in accusation. The blood of Abel spoke to sin and murder and grief. The blood of Jesus speaks to forgiveness and mercy and love. And so you have that transition. And then he says in verse 25, which like we'll work into at the end of this section, but it all just ties so well together. He says, so don't refuse him who is speaking. Listen to Jesus. But that's how we started, right? Hebrews chapter 1. God has spoken to us in many different times, in many different ways. Now he speaks to us through his son. And the whole of Hebrews is why we need to listen to Jesus, why he's more significant to listen to than all of the old law, why coming to him is more significant than coming to the covenant of the at Mount Sinai, why his sacrifice is better than the sacrifice of bulls and goats, why he is bringing us to God's presence more completely than the old covenant was ever able to bring people to God's presence, in part and in representation and shadow. So don't refuse him. Listen to him. Hear what he has to say. And that makes our suffering worth it. That makes going through the discipline and the training not easy, but worth it. So just like tying it all together, Cody, what do you see in this last section?
Yeah, I just think it's a wonderful conclusion to what he's been building up to and talking about the whole time. Like you said, there's references back to chapter 1 here at the end. So you can just tell this is his conclusion before he gets into like the specific exhortations and applications. And, his whole point has been, you guys need to cling to and listen to Jesus, because stuff is just so much better now. So why would you go back? You already have the better thing. Like we have seats at the table now, he talks about in verse 23, we're at the assembly of the firstborn whose names have been written in heaven. It's like your name is here. So just like step up to the plate, things are just so much better now, unless obviously we were to reject that invitation. But in 25 down through the end, he brings up this Haggai 2 reference. It says that God said he would shake the heavens and the earth again. And there's some debate about whether, what is shaken refers to Judaism or, we're talking end times things. Heavens and earth is like a turn of phrase that gets used to describe Jewish people and culture and things like that. And I do think that in Haggai, that's what's under discussion. But I think that what the Hebrews writer is doing here is he's taking what God said then and he's pointing to like this bigger principle of like all of these physical things will be no more at some point. Like God said he's going to shake these things up and those things are going to end up being removed. And so the Jewish way of life had all of those physical aspects, the sacrifices and things like that. Obviously the earth is physical. So he's saying like, why would you cling to these things that God said he's going to do away with, right? That's just, that's setting up a losing battle. Well, you know what can't be shaken, right? You know what's eternal? It's the kingdom of God. And you know who brought that? Jesus. So stick with him because he brought you this unshakable thing. So just hold on to that. Hold on to him. God always meant for these physical things to go away. So clinging to them just doesn't make much sense. Going back to Judaism, that's not respecting God or Moses or anyone. It's going against the plan. And going all through the Bible story, the worst thing you can do is go against the plan. But it doesn't have to be that way for them, right? They have this opportunity because they're able to listen to or read these words from the Hebrews writer. They have the opportunity to make that change, to say, you know what? You're right. I'm going to listen to Jesus. I'm going to cling to Jesus. And so what I want to kind of reflect on for this week is he's pretty clear towards the end here, what Christ brought, this kingdom, this is something that's unshakable. Like it is as guaranteed as anything, even though you can't see it, right? Like we can see people who are in the kingdom, but we can't like always see everything that God has going on. Even though you can't see it, you can have complete confidence in it. And, there isn't much of anything on this earth that you can have complete confidence in, but God and his kingdom, you can. And so let's be thankful for that. That's what he says here. He says, therefore, since we are receiving this kingdom that cannot be shaken, let's be thankful for it, right? Let's understand what a privilege we have to be a part of this family of God. And so I guess what I would say is, have we been showing our gratitude to God for everything that he's done for us to bring us into this new kingdom? Is that gratitude present when we're worshiping? Is that gratitude present when we go through difficult times? Is that gratitude present when we have the wonderful opportunity to be around God's people? Regardless of what your answer to that is, whether you think you've been showing gratitude before or not, let's just show more gratitude moving forward.
Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. If you liked this episode, give it a like, a share, or even a comment to let us know how we're doing. We hope we've helped you think, reflect, and be honest about your relationship with God, and we can't wait to see you again next week.